I recently went through a couple of installs of the native environment, so iOS development environment and Android development environment from scratch on an old MacBook Pro I have here. This one right here, it's a 13-inch from 2013, which some would argue is actually a pretty darn good machine even to this day. And the native development environment and tools work just fine on it. So that means NativeScript works just fine as well. But today I want to talk to you about the installation process, because it was a major pain doing that on this machine, and Shiva got online. He remote desktop into this machine to help me out installing everything, getting everything set up, because some of the documentation on the NativeScript site is a little confusing. And if you're new to NativeScript and if you're new to native development, then you might find it really difficult to get started. So I recorded that process and I'm going to share that with you in another video. That's going to be the Mac installation with all the issues that we ran into. It's probably going to be a little on the longer side. I'll try to cut it down as much as possible. And that's the video where Shiva helps me get installed and set up. Since then, I've reinstalled the environment a couple times. And today I'm going to run through the installation process yet one more time. This time, hopefully without any flaws, because I'm going to be installing it on my new MacBook Pro that I just got in the mail. Well, I didn't just get it. I got it a few days ago, but I haven't actually set it up yet because I wanted to wait until I create this video for you guys. And I'm really hoping everything is going to go smoothly. So here's my new MacBook Pro. It's the new 16-inch. It still has the packaging on it. This is going to be the first time I'm going to be opening this up and getting the native mobile environment set up and get NativeScript running on it. All right, let's do this. All right, so I got this new machine here, brand new. Look at those keys. I miss those keys so much. I haven't tried this out yet, not even in the store. So I'm really looking forward to getting set up with this. So it's gonna ask me for some basic stuff like language setup and initial setup. I'll be back after I get this initial stuff out of the way. Okay, here we go. So I've already set this up. I'm gonna set my MacBook Pro right here, and I'm gonna remote desktop into it from my desktop here. That way I can record the screen and show you everything that's going on. But once in a while, I might use this machine over here just for easier typing. So this is nothing on it. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pop open Safari so I can install Chrome. I use Chrome pretty much for everything. The debugging tools are really amazing on it, so I know I'm going to need that. And Chrome is a pretty quick and easy installation, so I'm going to do that first. Now comes the lengthy process, unfortunately, of installing Xcode and then Android Studio. I'm going to start with Xcode because that takes the longest. So I'm going to head over to App Store. Let's go ahead and search for Xcode here. There it is. And I'm going to click on this little button to go ahead and install it. You can see that that little ring has a long ways to go. While that's happening, let me explain to you why I'm doing it this way. A lot of times people will not have NativeScript set up, and they're going to come to the NativeScript website to get started with it, and they're going to see a script to follow. Let's go to nativescript.org. All right, then docs, install NativeScript. Okay, so here you're going to have the CLI setup. You're going to have the quick setup option and the full setup. I'm going to go to the full setup because the quick setup rarely works for me. There's always some bits and pieces that go wrong and missing. So I'm going to do the full setup, and that's what we're doing today. And here we're going to choose either advanced setup for Windows. You can see my video on that. I already have one of those on this channel. We're going to be doing the advanced setup for Mac today. And maybe one day I'll do Linux. I don't know how many people use Linux for native development with NativeScript. If you do use Linux, let me know down below in the comments. But we're going to be doing Mac OS here today. And here are the steps for the advanced setup. You can read some of the requirements here. Now, it does give you a script here, and that's to install homebrew. We're going to come back to that. We're not doing that right now. I will start out with this step over here. This is step 3 and then step 1 inside step 3. This documentation needs a little bit of help. Anybody out there willing to submit a PR on this? All right, so maybe I will once I'm done fledging this out. It says run the App Store and download Xcode. Basically what happens is not everybody is starting out with this documentation, with this setup in the same place. Some people might already have Xcode installed. In fact, if you've ever tried native development, you probably already have Xcode installed. Some people might have Android Studio installed. Or maybe you don't have Android Studio or Xcode, and then you are following these steps, but you might already have Node installed globally, which is gonna break, of course, because here we're using homebrew to install Node. And I admit that I don't know anything about homebrew. I know that it manages packages for you and it manages Node for you in a way that allows you to use Node from the command line without having to always do sudo or run as root. In a way that's good, but also it makes it a little bit confusing for those people that have never used homebrew and that are just coming to it. All I want to do is have xcode and nativescript installed at the CLI. I don't know what the heck homebrew is, and when I come to this page seeing homebrew, I get a little confused. That's what happened to me. Now, I'm sure homebrew is a pretty cool thing. After this thing though, after installing it here using the script, I'm not going to be touching it ever again. And that's why every time I do this, it's confusing to me because I never actually fully learn it. Anyway, the reason I'm doing it the way I'm doing it is installing xcode first and then Android Studio is because of the paths that we're going to need to set up for Android Home and Android SDK. Those are going to be different if you have Android Studio installed as opposed to using the homebrew method of installing Android SDKs. And I'm going to show you that a little bit later of how to obtain that information. And the reason I want Android Studio is installed because Android Studio is a really great tool to do performance monitoring, memory monitoring on your ready built apps. So you can build apps in nativescript and then open the projects up in Android Studio and then run them in Android Studio and do your performance monitoring that way. Android Studio also makes setting up and downloading SDK updates a lot easier, and also setting up your emulators. It makes it much easier to do that. Oh, look at that. The Xcode installation is going pretty fast actually, but it always gets stuck in that last quarter. I'll be back. All right, it's done. It didn't take that long actually. It took about 10 minutes total. So once Xcode is installed, make sure you open it. This is important. If you just install Xcode and don't do these parts, then the nativescript CLI is never going to actually complete building your applications for iOS. It's going to give you errors. So you need to actually agree to this. Then you need to make changes. So you need to enter your password. And then Xcode needs to install components. Basically, it's a bunch of tools that work in the background, like Xcode command line tools that actually are necessary for other CLIs to build iOS applications on Macs. If you're not building with Xcode, then you need a programmatic way to be able to trigger the builds, and that's what's being installed now. Once those are done installing, Xcode opens up. What I'm going to do here is check something out, and this is a spot that you need to know about. I'm going to go to Xcode menu at the top, and then Xcode preferences, and then check out the locations tab. So we're going to be coming back here a little bit later, but you want to make sure that command line tools here is selected. Sometimes after we go through the installation process, you might get weird build errors from when you're building for iOS, and it doesn't exactly tell you this as a problem. Okay, so if you do get Xcode or iOS build errors when you're building a nativescript app, this might be the culprit right here because command line tools somehow got unlinked from Xcode. Make sure it's here. It is, and that's fine. So now we're done with Xcode. I'm going to close out my app store. And once we're done with the Xcode part, we're done with iOS setup. Now we need to handle the Android setup, which is a little bit more complicated because there are more moving parts, but it actually doesn't take that long to install. So since I have Chrome open here, I'm going to open up a new tab and search for Android Studio. And there it is, download Android Studio and SDKs. I'm going to click on that right there, download Android Studio, and then download for Mac. Now this is going to run through the download, and then it's going to leave me with this DMG, which now I can double click here and run the installation for Android Studio. So there's a similar thing we have to do, drag this icon into our applications folder, and then it's just going to copy over. All right, now it's done. And just like with Xcode, we're going to need to do an initial run of Android Studio. It says Android Studio is an app downloaded from the internet. Are you sure you want to open it? Catalina is very sensitive about security, so I'm going to click on OK here. Now I don't have any settings to import, so I'm going to click OK here. And here's the wizard that's going to set up the development environment for Android Studio. So I'm going to go through this wizard. The type of setup I want is a standard setup. I want the standard theme. That's fine. And there is a summary. I'm going to click finish here to go ahead and run through the rest of the process which is going to download extra components and install them, kind of like Xcode did. All right, we've come to a very important part here, and this is the reason why you can't run Android emulators on a virtual machine and have this whole environment set up on a virtual machine, is because of this. This is hexam. I forgot what the heck is hexam. Oh, it's Intel's Hardware Accelerated Execution Manager. So basically, this ties your emulator when it's running right into the hardware, utilizing the hardware better, so the emulator is more performant. This is something that you can only install on the hardware machines themselves, not on virtual machines. So I'm gonna go ahead and give it my password and click OK here. Because we're running on Catalina, you might have things like this. So it says system extension blocked. Even though we're trying to install it, Catalina is now blocking us. So let's open up the security preferences here. And down here it says system software from developer Intel Corporation apps was blocked from loading. And we need to click this allow button, but it's grayed out. So we need to click on this lock here to say, okay, we need to authenticate you first. I'm going to touch on the touch ID right here. And then I can click allow. Then the rest of this setup process will keep going, and it says running Intel hexam installer. And now I'm a little bit confused whether this is done or not, but I'm going to guess that because the finish button is actually available for me to click, I'm going to go ahead and click on it, and I'm going to just assume that everything is working fine. Now, we're on the Android startup screen. So this is the startup page, which is very important because here you can actually access configure down here at the bottom, and you can access a couple things. One is the AVD manager. This is the virtual device manager. This is where you set up your emulators. And the other one is the SDK manager. So we need both of those. Let's take a look at the SDK manager first. And you can see that it opens up right to the Android SDK, and it says that the API level 29 is installed. I also like to have a couple of other API levels just to have it on my system and available. So I'm going to go ahead and select this Android 9. You can also go with Oreo and Nougat and Marshmallow, however far down you want to go. I'm just going to go with Android 9, API level 28. And one more thing you want to pay attention to in this screen is Android SDK location is located in Users, Alex, Library, Android SDK. I'm going to mention this again, but this is going to be important, and this is where you can look it up later. All right, some other tabs here are SDK tools, and you can see that hexam is installed down at the bottom. And some of the Google things are going to need to be installed when we actually use an emulator, but we'll come back to that. So I just selected Android 9, and I'm going to click OK here, which is going to go ahead and ask me to accept a licensing agreement, and then click Next. This is going to download that SDK version, API level 28. It's going to download it, it's going to unzip it, and have it available. All right, I'm going to click Finish here, and we're done. Now I want to set up a virtual machine, which is the Android emulator. So I'm going to go here to the Android startup screen again and configure, and then AVD manager. So here you can see that we don't have any virtual devices or emulators set up yet. So this is empty. It tells me create virtual device. That's the only option I have. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And by default, this is selecting Pixel 2, which I'm fine with. That's fine. It's a pretty recent device. Size is 5 inches, resolution and density are selected. I'm fine with all the defaults. I just want one emulator to start working. Later on, you can go and update and change the emulator and create new ones if you want. I just want one working. So I'm going to click Next here. The first thing that it needs to download is the image to run that emulator. So that's the virtual machine image. So here, if you want to run the Android Q operating system, you need to download this one, this image. If you want to be API level 28 compatible and you want to run Android Pie, you need to download this next one. So I'm going to download that Q image. And this is a big chunky file. It's over 1 gigabyte in size just for the Android emulator image. So that's going to take a couple minutes to download. All right. So it's downloaded, installed, and it says done down here, and it's giving me the finish option, which I'm going to click here. Optionally, you can also install Pi, the image for Pi. I'm going to skip that right now. Let's go ahead and click Next. Now I can name my virtual machine. I'm going to just leave this as default, and I'm going to click Finish here. Now we're on the AVD screen, the Virtual Device Manager, and now you can see that I have one virtual device there. I can click this little play button to actually kick up the emulator and start the emulator right now. So I'm going to click on that, and there it is, launching the emulator. And there it is. It says, Android Studio would like to access the microphone. Why? I have no idea why. You know what? Fine. You want to access the microphone? Go ahead and access the microphone. And there is my emulator. Now we have both Xcode and Android Studio set up and configured with all the tools. Let's go back to the advanced setup and just take a look at what we need here. So here are the advanced setup steps. The first thing that it tells you to do is actually install homebrew. All right, so it says ruby-e. So it's giving me a script to run basically on the command line that will install homebrew for me. So I'm going to go ahead and click this little button that says copy to clipboard. And now I'm going to open up terminal. I'm going to paste what I just copied right over here, and I'm going to hit enter. This is a script that goes through and installs homebrew and everything else that's part of that script. And on the last line, it says the xcode command line tools will be installed. Okay, we don't really need that because we already have xcode command line tools. Because of the sequence that I'm running things in, I already had xcode, so I'm installing homebrew now. This is going to mess things up. Very easy fix for this, but if you're not familiar with what you're doing, this might drive you a little nuts like it did to me. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter here and have it run through its thing. It needs the password, and it's going to run through the script and install all the different bits and pieces that it needs, including the command line tools for Xcode, which we don't really need anymore because we already have it, but it's part of the script. So it's a computer, it has to follow the script. It's going to do it anyway. Now, probably it would be smart as part of that script to detect if you already have command line tools installed and skip it if you do already. I have a feeling that the advanced setup documentation on nativescript.org is set up that way to have homebrew first and then Xcode set up because of this reason. However, as I mentioned before, you might already have Xcode installed. So I'm going to show you how to fix things up in case things break in Xcode. Okay, it's done. Now, let's take a look at Xcode. I'm going to head over here and open up Xcode. I'm going to go to the menu, Xcode preferences, and then locations. And take a look at that. You see that command line tools there? Nothing is selected in that drop-down, and that's a problem. So if now I try to run my NativeScript builds for iOS, it's going to break, and I won't know why. So let's select Xcode 11.2.1 or whatever version you have and relink it to Xcode. We're going to need to provide the password again. I'm going to click OK here, and we're done. All right, so now we shouldn't get that problem. Let's go back to the documentation. All right, now it says brew update. Since we just installed it, I don't know why we need to run brew update, but I'll do it anyway. All right, it says already up to date. That's what I figured. The next thing is installing Node. And the documentation says brew install Node version 10. However, I know that Node is not on version 10 anymore, and I want the latest LTS version of Node. So let's head over to nodejs.org, I believe it's called. And the latest version is 12. So 12 is the LTS, which is the long-term support version. And then on the right, you usually have the current version, which is 13. So if you just say brew install Node, it's going to get version 13. You can use version 13, but I usually like to use the LTS version because it's going to have long-term support. So we need to specify the version when we install it. And here the script says brew install Node at 10, which means version 10. We're going to install version 12. So brew install Node at 12. Okay. Notice there's no sudo here. You're not installing Node globally, so we don't have to worry about permissions when we install npm packages, for example. I'm going to hit enter here, and this is going to go ahead and download the cask, the brew cask, or whatever they call it, and unpack Node. And there we go. Now Node is installed. So if I hit node -- version, oh, it says command not found. And that's because, take a look at the lines right before here. It says, if you need to have Node 12 in your path, it says you need to do this. So it actually gives you the commands you can just copy and paste on the command line to get things going. This is pretty confusing for somebody who's never used Homebrew, and it's not really well documented in the NativeScript installation. It does say here, after you run the command above, you will see on the console if you need to have the software first in your path, run blah blah blah. Please add it to your path with the command and then restart the terminal. So it gives you a hint of what you should be looking for, and that's what's going on right here. Notice a couple other things. One is the actual output is telling me that this path is going to be added to this file, which is the ZSHRC file. And this documentation, the NativeScript documentation, says that this should be added to my bash profile. Now here in Catalina, by default, I'm using the Z shell. You can see that at the top, Alex-Z shell. Z shell is just a type of shell that you're using. It has some extra benefits over regular shell. I'm not exactly 100% sure what that means. I don't come from the Linux background, so I don't know what's going on with that. Catalina has that by default, but you might not have Z shell. You might have bash profile. So that's in your root directory. So this is the command I'm going to run on my machine to add the node command to my path. And what that means is that I can just issue the command node something on my terminal, and it'll find the node executable program and execute my command. So I'm going to paste that right there. There we go. And now I need to restart my terminal. So I'm going to close it and then restart it. And I'm going to issue the command node -- version, and that prints out the version. There it is, version 12.13.1. All right. Let's clear this, and we're on to the next step. So here in the documentation, it says, install the dependencies for iOS. We've already done xcode, and we've already done command line tools. Now, if you are following the documentation and you installed xcode after homebrew, then you can also use this command right here to check your version of the xcode build tool. So I'm going to issue that command right here. And there is the xcode build tool 11.2.1. This is the command line tools that we linked in xcode interface under locations. The next step is to install a Ruby gem called xcode project. What that does, I don't know, but we need it. Probably a dependency of the NativeScript CLI. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to copy this command and go to the terminal. Let's clear this. And I'm going to paste it here and click enter. This is a sudo command, so I'm going to need to enter my root password. There it is. It's going to go ahead through it and install it. It says 5 gems installed. Great. The next step is installing CocoaPods. Now, CocoaPods is important because a lot of third-party libraries that we can use with iOS and therefore in NativeScript are distributed using CocoaPods. These are iOS libraries that you can just use in NativeScript, and a lot of NativeScript plugins use CocoaPods to package together these native libraries. So we do need that for sure. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste that in here. Sudo gem install CocoaPods, and it's going to go ahead and install CocoaPods. All right, 24 gems installed. I'm going to clear that. Let's see. The next step is setting up CocoaPods. So it says pod setup. I'm going to issue that command, pod setup. All right, I guess it did it. Next is install pip. Now, pip is a package manager for Python. Let's copy that line and issue the command right here, sudo easy install pip. Okay, that looks like it installed the dependencies for pip. I didn't get any errors, so everything's looking good. The next step is installing a Python package using pip that we just installed, and the Python package is called 6. Why aren't we doing 1 through 5? I have no idea, but we need 6. So I'm going to go ahead and install that. Pip install 6, press enter. Now, this is interesting, and I don't know what's going to happen here. It says deprecation. Python 2.7 will reach the end of its life on January 1st, 2020. I'm recording this on December 10th, 2019. So does that mean that in 20 days or 21 days that this is not going to work anymore? I don't know. And do we need to run through the same process after the next version of Python comes out? Do we need to add extra steps to install the next version of Python to get this going? Well, I don't think things are just going to stop working. I think that Python 2.7 will remain on your system and keep working, but I'm not too familiar with the Python lifecycle to really be able to speak about that. So if you do know what's going to happen, how NativeScript is going to be affected, please leave a comment down below. It also gives you a URL here that you can check out right here as part of the error message. I'm going to click on open URL here, and it's going to tell you about the end of life and the details about that. All right, I'm not going to go into that now. Let's clear this and let's head to the next step. All right, so now it says install dependencies for Android development. So I'm going to use Homebrew here to tap this OpenJDK cask. Let's go ahead and paste that in here and enter. That actually taps 26 casks, which is this OpenJDK or Java Development Kit. Then the next step is brew cask install adopt OpenJDK 8. Let's run that command. Clear this and paste, and there we go. That's going to go ahead and install this cask adopt OpenJDK 8. That's done. Successfully installed. All right, we're doing pretty well here, huh? No errors so far. Now, the next step is set the Java home system environment variable. All right, before we do that, I want to make sure that that's the correct path for Java home. Let's see now. cd usr lib exec / Java home. So it looks like we do have a Java home installed in that path that matches the documentation. So that's good. I'm going to go ahead and execute this line right here. So what this is going to do is set up that environmental environment called Java home, which is going to be important for NativeScript CLI. I'm going to copy that line right there, and I'm going to paste it here and execute that line. Now, the next step is actually something we don't need to do. And it says install Android SDK. And the reason we don't need to do that is because we started off with installing Android Studio first. And if you install Android Studio, the path of Android Home or the Android SDK is going to be different than if you install it using Homebrew. So here is the installation step that'll install Android SDK using Homebrew. We're going to skip that step. If you don't have Android Studio installed, or if you're not planning to use Android Studio, then you still need the Android SDK. So you're going to need to do this step, brew cask install Android SDK. However, I recommend that you get Android Studio installed because it's an important tool and it's going to be important for you going forward with debugging and troubleshooting and performance testing of your NativeScript apps. So here, this step, it says export Android home equals USR local share Android SDK. But that's not going to work. Let me show you why. I'm going to cd to USR local share Android SDK, and there's nothing there. So when I tap for tab completion, there is no Android SDK folder there because the Android SDK folder was not installed using Homebrew, it was installed using Android Studio, and it's a different location. So I'm going to open up Android Studio again to show you where you can find that. There it is, the start page, and go to configure and then SDK manager. I showed you this a little bit earlier. Under system settings, Android SDK, you can see at the top here it says Android SDK location, and it's users Alex library Android SDK. You can copy this line from here. I'm just going to go ahead and copy that by pressing Ctrl+C, cancel out of the screen, and I can cd to that location. All right, so that location does exist. So what I want to do is actually export Android home variable, just like it says in the documentation here, but instead of this path, I'm going to use the path I copied. So export Android underscore home equals, and then that path, which is different than the other path you see up there in the docs. Press enter, there we go. Now we've created the other environmental variable that's going to be used by the NativeScript CLI to build Android apps. Okay, now the documentation is not completely bad here. They do say that in a note, if you're installing via Android SDK Manager, then the path for Android Home would be blah, blah, blah. Then that's right. However, for somebody that's new to Android SDK, Android Studio, this sentence right here doesn't mean much. It should be a little bit more clear. Like if you installed Android Studio, your path will be such and such. And this $user ID, it could be $user ID literally. Like press the any key. Where's the any key? It's not here on the keyboard. You need to say that this is going to be actually your user ID, because people that are new to Linux, people that are new to the environment might not know that. One more thing to note. These environmental variables that you've set up might not be available next time if you restart the terminal. So you have to actually save them. So let's see. Right now, if I say $Android home, it's telling me permission denied because I tried to just run that folder. But I can see that Android home is actually pointing to that folder. By the way, if you're using environmental variables on the command line, you need to put a $, in front of it, just like I did here. So it is linked. What happens if I close the terminal? So I'm going to go to terminal, quit terminal, and then I'm going to go to terminal again, restart it, and we need to make the font bigger. And then I'm going to say $Android home. Where is it? It's gone. So that means we need to save it. So I didn't save it. I just wanted to demonstrate to you that if you don't save it, it's not going to be saved and it's going to be gone the next time you restart. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit that file, the profile file, and I'm going to use VS Code to do that. Now I know I need VS Code, Visual Studio Code, because I'm going to be working with VS Code as my editor. Whatever editor you might have, you can use that. But I use VS Code, so I'm going to install it now. VS Code, there it is. Download for Mac, and there's the zip file. I'm going to go ahead and unzip that, and there it is. I probably need to install it to my applications folder. So I'm going to open up my applications folder and drag VS Code in there. Okay. When I try to run it, it says this software needs to be updated. Contact the developer for more info. So that's a problem. I'm going to go to System Preferences, go to Security and Privacy, and it says Visual Studio Code was blocked. All right, so I need to open anyway. And I'm going to click that, and I'm going to click Open, and finally Visual Studio Code opens. And I'm going to open up my root folder, which is called Alex. Visual Studio Code would like to access your photos. I'm not sure why. I'm going to disallow that. It's asking me to access my calendar, my reminders. I don't know why it's asking me all that. Something really strange going on with Catalina and these installations. It's not making it easy, that's for sure. All right, so here you'll see that we have this zshrc file, and this is where we save that path, the node path. Now I can create a profile file here. So let's head over here, and I'm going to call it this right here, Z profile. Let's copy that. And I'm going to create a new file right next to that in the root called .zprofile. So here, this file is going to be ran every time you open up the terminal. And it's going to save the Java home and Android home in there. So I want to go ahead and copy this and paste it here. This is for Java home. And then I also want to export Android home. And that's going to require me going back to Android Studio because I closed it out, configure, SDK manager, and then grabbing this line again. Let's go ahead and copy that and go over here. I'm going to put it in quotes. There it is. It's pointing to my SDK. Let's close this out and let's test it out. So I'm going to head over here, close my terminal out, quit terminal. Let's open up the terminal again. And here I'm going to say $Android home. And there it is. All right. So it saved it. And even if I restart my terminal or restart my machine, Android home is going to be saved. Finally, we've taken care of that. So we're going to skip the Android SDK. We've set up the Android home. Let's keep going here. Now, the next step it says is, in addition, install all packages for Android SDK Platform 28 and Build Tool 28. So remember, over here in Android SDK, we've already installed Platform 28. But we didn't install some of the tools that 28 might require. And this script right here actually does it for you. So I'm going to copy this and let's go over to the terminal again, clear this, and I'm going to run that script. This is going to take a little bit of time because it needs to download everything for API level 28 and install it. And we've reached our first error. So hopefully this is not going to be something that's fatal. It's not really an error, it's a warning. It says, file blah 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 could not be loaded. I don't know, it's a warning. I think I've seen this before and I don't think it hurts our progress here. So I'm going to clear this. Let's go to the next step, which is finally installing the NativeScript CLI. So this is a command, and notice it doesn't have the sudo in it, which means we can run npm globally install NativeScript and not use sudo. Let's give it a shot. So first I'm going to see if npm is here, npm version, and yes, npm is here, which is great. So npm, you can say I or install, write it out. I'm just going to say I-G, which means global, and then NativeScript, enter. This is going to install the NativeScript CLI. We're getting so close now. I just feel it. Okay, it says, do you want us to help improve NativeScript by automatically sending anonymous statistics? And I'm going to say no for now. And then if you're using bash or zish, you can enable command line completion. I'm going to skip that. That's fine. And it says enter your email address. I'm going to go ahead and leave it empty and press enter. Okay, so it looks like NativeScript CLI was installed. I'm going to clear this. And in fact, I'm just going to restart the terminal. So I'm going to quit terminal and I'm going to restart it. Let's make this bigger again. And I'm going to say NativeScript -- version. Cool. It's there, 6.2.2. You can also issue TNS -- version. TNS is just a shortcut for NativeScript. and it's there. Clear this. And now we're going to run a command that's going to diagnose the system and see if everything is installed properly. And that's tns doctor or nativescript doctor. So this is going to go through and it says no issues were detected. And this is going to give you a checklist of what it's looking for basically. Android Home, ADB, all the things that we went through and installed manually. It's checking for all those things to make sure that they're there and set up properly. And I got all green check marks, so I'm pretty happy about that. And of course, the first thing I'm going to do is create a new directory where I'm going to keep my code going forward. And I'm going to create a new nativescript project and test it out on both iOS and Android. So let's do that. I'm in my home folder. I'm going to create a new directory called code and go into that directory and say tns create first proj --tsc for TypeScript. This is going to create a new nativescript project. I'm going to go ahead into the project directory, cd first proj, clear this, and I'm going to say tns run iOS. So this is supposed to build for iOS using the xcode tools that we've already installed and start up the iOS simulator for us automatically. I've never started up the iOS simulator on this machine. Hopefully it'll work. And it looks like it is. It's starting up the iPad Air 3rd generation with iOS 13. Why iPad Air? I don't know, but you can change that later. It looks like it's starting up iOS just fine and the simulator is kicking up just fine. And now Webpack is building in the background. And while the simulator is starting up, the build process is being completed. We're going to do the same thing for Android in a second. And there you can see in the background we have an xcode build. And this is making a lot of noise right now. Check it out. The computer fan is going crazy over there. Hopefully this new i9 processor is not going to burn my table. All right, look at that. We have the Hello World project running and I'm pretty happy about that. Let's try the same thing on Android. So I'm going to press Ctrl+C here and clear this and say tns run Android. Now, I have had times where the first time I ran this actually fails. But what I did here was leave the Android emulator that I started back up after I created it. I left it running in the background so it's easy for the CLI, the nativescript CLI, to find it. For some reason, when I have the Android simulator or the emulator up and running, the first time I do it, it finds it really quickly. And then after that, there's no problems. So that's another bonus tip for you. If this is the first time you're setting up, run that emulator first before you kick off the run process from nativescript, and you should have no problems. So there's our build process going on in the background. The fan is just going completely crazy over here. And it's installed my nativescript app on the Android emulator and it kicked it off and there it is. It's working fine and it's looking pretty lovely. So there you go. My new Mac is configured and set up with 2 native development environments for iOS and for Android. And the nativescript CLI is installed and ready and working with those environments and everything is configured properly. And that's the sequence that you should be following if you're starting up from a brand new computer. If you are curious to see what errors I ran into installing it on my older machine, not because the machine is older, but because I have the sequencing of installation parts that I did. And then Shiva helped me out with that. You can check out that other video. So hopefully this helps out some of you folks that are looking for this information and are frustrated by the setup process to get all your native stuff set up. If you haven't subscribed to this channel, please subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.